I don't know what's worse, the screams that ended a few weeks ago, or the silence that has fallen since then. Before, I felt like everything should be done to help others. Now, in my self-reflection, I don't know anymore. It was like any other day in the city. Sunny, crowded, and busy. I was walking to work. I worked at a large national bank where I recently began my internship. I remember that day well, because, besides the obvious fact that the world ended on this day, I had finally convinced myself to talk to the cute secretary across the hall from me. Things just seemed to be going my way that day. I walked to work, traffic was good. That's when the alarm sounded. There was mass panic, as is expected. I watched as thousands of people ran in hysteria, all going absolutely nowhere. Some of the people ran for the subways, anything deep in the ground. There's only so many places to go, and as I stated before, people weren't getting very far. The only option I really had was to follow those going to the subways. There were some military personnel in the corridor, instructing us to go down the tunnel, wearing full military gas suits, like they were equipped for some sort of bio-air attack. Couldn't see their faces at all, and they looked ominous. Some people were crying, and the children were screaming as their parents dragged them into the ever-darkening tunnel. It must have been a few hours that I walked in darkness with the crowds of people, before more military personnel, dressed in similar attire, as described before, signal us to turn left into the behemoth of a vault. The characters N77R 2D80F were written across some of the steelwork. I was lucky enough to have gotten in, because I heard gunshots right after walking through the metal frame, and the large bronze doors were shut behind us. More screams could be heard outside, and more gunshots. Things got quiet outside after a few minutes. The explosions began 15 minutes later. The sound was deafening, and the ground shook like the gods themselves were trying to kill us. The children continued to scream through it all, and it continued long after. The thing that disturbed me the most was the lack of noise outside. Things remained quiet in the vault for the next few days. People talked about what might have happened on the outside, and the general consensus was that it was a nuclear explosion that had been detonated on the surface. It was a miracle that we were still all alive, to be honest. There was a small cafeteria for us, but it was obviously overwhelmed by the amount of refugees here. The food rations were fairly small and seemed inhumane, though we all knew there wasn't enough to go around. It was around the third or fourth day that the noises began to come from outside the vault. The soldiers were instructed by their superiors not to open the doors for any reason. I think we were all thankful for that. None of us wanted to see what was on the other side, especially now when we heard their pleas. "We know you're in there. You have to let us in. Help us. We're dying out here. Do something." Their cries went on for around 3 hours before gunshots sounded on the other side of the wall. I don't want to know who those shots came from, but we were all glad for the quiet. After a week more, the voices were back. This time they cursed and threatened us all on the other side. They went on to say that once they were inside, they eat our flesh and suck the marrow from our bones like a straw. I tried not to let it get to me, but it wasn't working. The voices followed me into my dreams and caused me horrible nightmares. I dreamt I was on the outside, in the probably leveled city, being chased by some humans trying to eat me. I know they're just dreams, but who knows? That's not too far from reality. Recently, the leaders of the vault have all agreed that our rations should be halved. There was protests, and a small fraction tried to take the cafeteria, but they were all shot. I've begun hoarding the food I've gotten in my bag for work. Like I said, there's not a lot, but I stow away what I can when I can. They're inside the vault. I caught a glimpse of them as I ran through the corridors, and those things are not humans. They have horrible green glowing eyes, and their hairless skin is yellow. I locked eyes with one of them, and in that moment I felt the hatred he, or it, felt for me. A step, 2 steps, and then finally a burst of rounds into his head from his left. I didn't stop to wait and greet my savior. I ran, and I ran as fast and as hard as I could run. You'll probably think me a coward for what I'm about to say, but I don't care. I arrived in the cafeteria and went straight for the kitchen. Breakfast was being served, so one of the storerooms wasn't locked up, and no one was around. I locked the giant door behind me and listened to the carnage outside of my door. Some shots continued to ring throughout the next couple hours, and then it was silent. I spent my time taking stock of what food I had, and it was enough to survive for, let's just say, A heck of a long time. A soldier lay inside near the door, with his rifle in his front, and his sidearm still holstered. I grabbed the sidearm and pocketed it. I have been in this room for longer than I can keep track. By the amount of cans stacked against the wall, I can only guess it's been a month. The corpse in the room began to rot a long time ago, and the stench is horrendous. It fills my nostrils day and night. The worst of it is, they know I'm in here. They know I've locked myself in this room, and they keep telling me I'm going to die here. I'm going to die in this room. This is the place. They whisper to me in my sleep that they'll peel my eyelids off my head and rip my fingers off one by one. I spent the day curled up in the corner, watching the man rot, wishing that my own torment would end. I've thought to myself many times that I could just shoot myself in the temple, and this nightmare would go away. The food is dwindling, and the idea is more and more tempting. Those things call my name. In my loneliness, I told them who I was. They tell me to open the door, and it'll all be over. Those hollow, unhuman things tell me to end it, and the torture, on my own terms. They got one thing right. Tomorrow, when I wake up, I'm ending it on my own terms.
For the first 12 years of my life, I grew up in northern Canada. I had a normal family, a normal house, normal school, normal town. Nothing in my life was out of the ordinary. Everything was as it should be. Of course, Canada is usually known for being cold, and according to my grade school education, northern parts of places usually have colder, snowier winters. When I was about 10 years old, I had 5 friends: Evie, Quincy, Samantha, Rhoda, and Jonathan. I specifically remember having a crush on Evie. She had green eyes, I think. Yes, dazzling, beautiful green eyes and auburn hair. Evie had a sister, Jamie. She loved to bake and always made cookies when I came over. She made the best oatmeal raisin cookies in the world. Whenever Evie and I were coloring or something, she would give Evie this look and wink at me. I think she knew how much I liked her. Sam and Quincy were twins, and they both had blonde hair. They moved in across the street when I was almost 8. They did everything together and were pretty antisocial. I think I was their only friend. Rhoda's mother was a good friend of my mom's, and we would always play Candyland or something while our mothers talked. I never liked her much. Jonathan was my best friend. We were inseparable and loved to play pirates. All my friends and I had one thing in common. We loved to play in the snow. Snowball fights, tobogganing, you name it, we loved it. But one gloomy afternoon when I was 12 years old, that all changed. My friends and I were going to have a snowball fight. We would all meet up at this stick we put in the ground called Snowman Corner, count to 3, then run away and throw snowballs at each other until we got tired. At about 11 a.m. on a Sunday afternoon, we met up at Snowman's Corner. Rhonda yelled, 1, 2, 3, and we all ran like hell. I ducked behind a tree and started to make snowballs when I was ambushed by Sam and Quincy. Sam giggled and Quincy ran away. I nailed Sam and she whitewashed me until I said uncle. She dashed off and I stood up to find another place to hide. From what I could hear, everyone was in one place and having a ton of fun. I was about to join them when I realized I had no snowballs. I cursed under my breath at Quincy and Sam for making me waste them all. Then walked until I found a wooden fence. I looked over it and saw an old abandoned cabin. Yes, I whispered, hopping the fence. I sat there making snowballs for a while, listening to the occasional shriek, giggle, or thud. It was comforting. I was making my last snowball when everything fell silent. I didn't hear the sounds get quieter or decrease in number. Everything just got quiet. I assumed everyone had left without me and was about to call out when I heard a loud scream. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was Rhoda. They must have just stopped to reload. But then I heard Quincy. It was a scream of obvious agony, not surprise or pain. Shortly after, I heard Sam's loud sobs and then an ear-piercing scream. Evie screamed, "No, no!" I was so scared. What was going on? Jonathan's scream was worst of all. I swear I heard my heart shatter. I cried for what felt like hours. When it dawned on me, I needed to get out of there. I peeked over the fence and saw nothing. I hopped over and started to run. After about 5 minutes, I was in a large field near a playground that Jonathan and I loved to play at. I held back tears and continued to run, or at least tried to. I stopped dead in my tracks when I felt a frail hand on my shoulder. I spun on my heels to face a beautiful girl about my age. She was obviously French. She had a soft face with pale blue eyes and dark hair. I was relieved until I noticed that she only been wearing a thin white nightgown. I staggered back in amazement at the fact that she was also barefoot. Big mistake. I toppled over and she kneeled down to me. She was sickly, skeletally thin and frail. Her nightgown was covered in dirt and food and what looked like blood. That's when I noticed about 50 people starting to encircle me. The girl stroked my face and smiled. "Shh," she whispered. "I'm helping you, remember that." I frantically looked at the people until I saw a pair of sparkling green eyes. "Evie, no!" She just stared at me. I began to see my other friends in the crowd staring at me. I broke from the girl's grasp and tried to run, but she pinned me down and screamed, "I'm helping you!" I threw her off of me and pushed over a little girl to get out of the circle. I ran and kept running. When I got home, I had a nervous breakdown and told my mother what had happened. She immediately grabbed the phone and asked Rhoda's mother if she had come home. She hadn't. Neither had Quincy or Sam or Evie or Jonathan. My mother told all of them to come over, and when they showed up, she told me to go play upstairs. I remember seeing a police car speed off to the woods. Now that I'm older, I've decided to dig more into the case. I went to the police station and asked if I could see the file. They said yes. I reread my story, then looked at the other details of the case, and my stomach did a 360-degree turn. It said that the officers found the cabin, broke down the door, and found my friends horribly mutilated, propped up at the table with mugs of hot chocolate sitting in front of them. They took the hot chocolate and mugs for forensic, then went upstairs. They found over 50 bodies in the closets, also horribly mutilated. They said that they showed pictures of the victims taken before they were murdered to me, and I remember they asked if I recognized them, and I said yes. They asked if I knew their names, and I didn't. I told them. They were with the girl. I remember them giving my mother a look, then saying I could go, and they gave me a lollipop. I ran off in glee, but the file said that the people had been dead for a long time, the longest being 2 years. But what was even more disturbing was the fact that most of these people were from places miles and miles away from where the cabin was. The thing that disturbs me the most to this day is the fact that after they took away the hot chocolate on the initial sweep, they came back to collect the bodies and found that there were 5 new mugs on the table, all filled with steaming hot chocolate.
You may remember hearing about it on the news, but in July of 2008, there was a string of missing persons cases out of the University District in Seattle. 12 people went missing, all of them students at the University of Washington. Their bodies were never found, and no significant evidence was ever recovered. They were all presumed dead, much to the distress of the people who cared about them. Aside from the missing people, though, not much of the case was ever revealed to the public. That's what I'm here to remedy. People have a right to know these things. As of now, the case has gone cold, and all the documents relating to it now sit in the classified file cabinet that SPD employees jovially refer to as the freezer. Investigators had followed several leads, but all of them had arrived at dead ends. They'd quixotically sworn to bring the criminal, or criminals, to justice, but when all of their attempts at moving the case forward had failed, they'd backed off like frightened kittens, kicked in the gut. The most promising lead, however, had been one that showed itself relatively early in the case's lifespan, around September of the first year. It turned out that all of the abducted students had owned the same Apple computers. This, in and of itself, could have been mere coincidence, but further examination by the forensic team showed that every single student had been using proxy servers before the time of their disappearance. For those who don't know, a proxy server is an intermediary web server often used to keep internet activity as anonymous as possible, disguising IP addresses, which again, for those who don't know, are essentially a unique series of numbers given to each computer connected to the internet. With basic knowledge and just a bit of hacking skill, it's possible to find someone's exact location by using their IP alone. Proxy servers operate with separate IP addresses, usually with locations far away from their users. So the students were all using altered IP addresses. But why? Were they hiding from someone? Proxy servers are, after all, the best way to hide yourself over the internet. As the forensic team continued to garner information from the abducted students' hard drives, more and more similarities were found. Some of them certainly could have been coincidences, but others, there was frankly no way. This is a segment of a report typed up by the computer forensics team detailing the similarities between the 12 laptops. All computers installed with the web browser Google Chrome. All computers using iTunes, each with approximately 50 gigabytes of music. All computers using proxy servers. All proxy servers appear to have IP addresses based in Iceland. They were all using proxies based in Iceland, which was odd, but the report didn't end there. It continued. All computers have Microsoft Word installed, though there appear to be no documents saved in the documents folders of any of the computers. That's normal enough. Lots of people save their documents in folders on their desktops or on other drives. Desktops on all computers are devoid of files and icons, except for a document that appears in the center of them all, titled Lita Abak. The document has no text. That's where it begins to get very strange. Lita Abak is Icelandic, meaning something like look back or look behind you. It appears the file on the desktop is the only document saved anywhere on all 12 computers. Once is a coincidence, twice is also a coincidence, but 12 times? The exact same empty document saved in the same place with the same title. It's impossible. But clearly not so impossible that it's, well, impossible. The report continued for a bit after that, but with nothing nearly as significant. When the keyboards were dusted for fingerprints, none of them matched up. There was nothing linking them other than the documents. The forensic specialist was spooked by the findings, but none of them reported any suspicious or paranormal activity afterwards. The Icelandic-based proxy servers and documents with titles in Icelandic led investigators to seek other connections between Iceland and the missing students. They went to their parents, probably hoping to find that all the students had relatives in Iceland or something. They needed to solve the case. But of course, none of them had any apparent ties to the country. No relatives, no friends, nothing. The investigators had questioned dozens of people, but had found nothing of worth. It was beginning to seem hopeless. That was, until a year later, in July of 2009, when the Iceland National Police in Reykjavik reported a string of missing persons, gone without a trace. This was it. This was what the SPD needed. They eagerly contacted the office in Reykjavik and arranged a meeting, hoping that the cases would somehow match up. Seattle investigators flew overseas, and the information they found was, simply put, terrifying. 12 people in Reykjavik had gone missing, all of them students at the University of Iceland. They all had Apple computers. They all used proxy servers. The proxy's IPs were based in Seattle. They all had Microsoft Word installed, but only one empty document saved on their empty desktops. Can you guess what it was titled? Lita Abak. When both investigation teams shared their information, things finally looked bright for both cases. This was obviously the work of the same criminal mastermind. It had to have been. They were going to catch whoever or whatever did this. It was all in the name of justice, even when there weren't any bodies to be found, and for all they knew, the missing students could have been alive and well and peaceful. The rush of optimism ended after a few days, when the forensic team in Iceland dusted the computer keyboards, only to find that none of the prints matched. The SPD agents, although disappointed, weren't surprised. Once again, it was hopeless, like so much else. There was still no suspect. There was still no evidence to convict. There was just a bunch of very, very creepy, not so much coincidences. 24 of them to be exact. Nothing more, and certainly nothing less. The leads led nowhere. The search for what happened to the students became a joint investigation between the overseas offices, but there were never any more significant leads. The cases, or just singular case now, had gone stagnant, and after months and months and months of dwindling tenacity, both the SPD and Iceland National Police finally put the case on the shelf in July of 2012. Cold, frozen, barren, tundra. It was over. So much for justice. Since then, both police departments have tried to forget about the case. It's become a hollow memory. No one likes to think about it, understandably. And that's all there is to the case, really. I'm telling you this now because I'm pretty bored, and I figured it was interesting enough to let you know about. I need to go take a shower now. However, before I go, I'd just like to make sure you realise how difficult it was to brainwash the students by getting them to listen to my stories. Humans are very perceptive when it comes to things like that. Their meat was worth it though. Very tender and delicious. But I'm still a bit hungry. Lita Abak.
He was the sweetest child in the world. There was no doubt about that. The moment he was born, people gathered around the nursery, pointing at his sleeping form and cooning. What gorgeous hair! What beautiful lips! What adorable chubby cheeks! Fathers ignored their own newborn children in favour of that tiny, perfect baby. Mothers toddled to the glass and pressed their faces against it, crying for their poor fortune. How much better a life would be if that child was theirs. The nurse that delivered him was amazed when she first held him in her arms. His skin was creamy white, not that mottled pink every other baby sported. At first she thought he was dead, his eyes shut and his dark brown curls matted against his skull. As soon as she held him, however, she knew he was just fine. He opened his eyes and looked at her with all the intelligence of an adult, breathing calmly and wrapping his tiny infant fingers around a loose strand of her thin blonde hair. He never once cried, and his mother worried from her bed, sitting up and crying out at the nurse that so lovingly cradled her baby. "My baby, what's wrong with him?" Her voice was weak and her eyes fluttered as she exhaustively fumbled at the bedsheet she was swaddled in. The nurse glared at her over this perfect babe's head and snapped at the woman. There was nothing wrong with this child, and there would never be. Reluctantly, the nurse snipped the child's umbilical cord and set him gently in the nursing, loving, kissing his head and promised that she would come back for him. Late that night, the nurse quietly tiptoed back into the mother's room, a hospital-issued pillow clutched calmly in her hands. She smothered the mother silently and cleanly, with no one the wiser. The child would be hers no matter what she has to do for it. She would kill 1,000 women to get her hands on that lovely little boy. Swiftly, she crept back into the nursery, bending over the tiny crib that held her angel. Grinning, she told the baby boy stories of how she would love him as he grew, and how well taken care of he would be. The nurse didn't even hear the man sliding into the nursery behind her, a scalpel held firmly in his left hand. She didn't even feel the cold steel slide delicately around her slender throat. She didn't feel the two sides of her skin part, cleanly, when so gently coaxed by the clean blade. Nor did she feel the sick gush of blood out of her throat as she happily died, her fingertips gently caressing the perfect child's gorgeous face, even in the last throes of death. The man who had so proficiently murdered the nurse stepped over her dying body. A look of absolute adoration plastered on his face. Without a word, he picked the child up into his arms and stole out of the hospital. Behind him, every nurse and doctor in the maternity ward went insane looking for him. It was a serene summer's night outside, warm enough for the man to carry the baby back to his apartment, leaving his car and his very pregnant wife back at the hospital he had so deftly escaped from. When he arrived back at his apartment, he did not sleep. Instead, he sat the tiny beautiful boy on his bed and watched him. For 14 days he watched the child, only moving to feed it and bathe it and give it all the care it needed and more. The babe was the centre of his universe. Soon, his wife came home, with a mouthful of angry words to toss at her neglectful husband and a tiny babe of her own to care for. "You left me alone at that hospital to have a baby all on my own? Not a word from you. I thought you were dead, Adam." She threw her purse profusely at her husband, who had yet to even look at her. The baby in the stroller she had been so lovingly attentive to before opening the door was left back at the entrance to the apartment. The child inside it woken up by his mother's piercing shrieks. When the mother walked up to kick the man she so suddenly and violently despised, she laid eyes on the most perfect child she had ever seen. It was a tiny, glowing white child, with huge black eyes, and the most flawless dark curls on the face of the earth. Without hesitation, she leapt towards her weakened, starved husband, and choked the last bits of life out of him. Desperate to lay her lips against the child, watching his face turned increasingly blue and frantic the tighter she pulled her longing fingers round his neck. Moments later she was on the bed, wrapped as tightly around the darling babe as she could be without harming it. She drank in its warmth, ignoring the increasingly distressed cries of her own child. Soon, irritated beyond belief by her own incredibly flawed child's cries for affection, she took her aggression out on it. Leaping up from the bed as quickly as she could, not wanting to be away from the vision of beauty sleeping serenely on her bed for too long, she picked her child up with one hand, slamming it fiercely against the wall of the apartment until his head was a mess of blood and bone and brain bubbling out, dirtying her hands. The police came knocking on the apartment door not too much longer, terrified by the vicious noise in the apartment beside them. The family next door had dialed 911, reporting domestic abuse. Cautiously, hands on their guns that rested at their hips, the two police entered the apartment. Upon entering, their noses were assaulted by several awful smells. Rot, death, and the smell of someone who had been sitting in their own filth for 2 weeks wafted through the air of this stuffy apartment. It did not take long for the officers to see the destruction that had occurred in this place. The gaunt dead husband dragged half-heartedly into the hallway, his hair matted with blood. The younger officer swayed on his feet, threatening to faint. "Listen, Tredu, sir. I have a pregnant wife at home. I can't do this. I can't get killed here." His plea was quiet and despondent, but the elder officer simply waved the man forward. They could hear cooing in the bedroom down the hall, and stepping over the dead man that lay at the entrance, entered the open doors of the room. Immediately upon entering, the elder officer bent down and vomited. The scene that met his eyes too much for even someone as experienced as him to handle. Blood was smeared on the walls where a dead baby, lying there on the floor, its face a smashed mess, had been mercilessly beaten. On the bed was a chubby woman, obviously the woman who had borne and murdered the baby. Cradled in her arms, pressed firmly against a swollen breast, was a naked, rotten baby, its skin blue and its mouth muffed up with death. She was whispering to it so sweetly, the most contented look on her face. The younger officer, however, was calm. It was clear what he must do. That woman held an angel, and he wanted it. Such a perfect child had never existed. The decision was easy to make. Pulling out his gun quickly, he shot the woman once in the head, delighting in the explosion of gorgeous crimson that found out behind her. The younger man's companion turned, a look of confusion on his face. Immediately, he was met with 2 bullets to the left eye. Smiling, the younger man watched his friend slide back against the already bloodied wall behind him. That baby would be his, and no one would stop him from taking it now. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I want to say a massive thank you to LillieCNation, Creepy Ghost Stories, and Brimstone Below for taking part in Collab Week. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. You can also leave a comment below. All feedback, good or otherwise, is always appreciated. If you have any creepy stories of your own, or of any topics that you would like me to cover, feel free to send them in via any of my social media. You can find all links to my social media in the description below. Until next time guys, make sure you lock your doors, stay safe, and I'll see you next video.